For 6 years, Tessa Ashby ran operations for the most dangerous man in Boston. And in all that time, he never once said her name like it belonged to a person. She knew the safe codes. She knew the shipping schedules of 17 companies. She knew exactly who to call at 2 a.m. when a container got held at the port in South Boston. She was 27 years old. She had a mother on dialysis and $187,000 in medical debt. And she'd worn the same coat for 4 winters. 12 times she'd put a plan on Nolan Rourke's desk. 12 times it came back, crossed out with the same black fountain pen. No notes, no explanation, just 2 words in the corner. Not needed. She never asked why. She just counted. She counted everything. That was how she survived. But on a Tuesday morning in November, something that had been bending inside her for 14 months finally snapped, and she walked into his office and slammed the folder down on his desk, hard enough to make the glass ring. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. A man who'd built an empire on never showing anything just sat there with his hands flat on the wood and looked at her, the way you look at something that isn't supposed to exist in your world. 41 seconds of silence. Then she reached into her bag and set down a second piece of paper. It was folded into quarters, and the creases had gone soft, because she'd been carrying it for 14 months. It was her resignation. And by the time Nolan Rourke understood what he'd just let walk out of that room, it was already too late to take a single one of those 12 refusals back. If you're already hooked, hit that like button so we know you're with us. Share this one with someone who's ever felt invisible at work. And subscribe, because these are the stories we tell best. Now let's go back to that 40th floor. To a woman with a folded letter and a man who was about to lose the only person he couldn't replace. 41 seconds passed, and at the 40-second mark, Tessa spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. That was what surprised her most, because for 14 months she had imagined this moment again and again, and in every version of it, she had screamed. But now, standing here, she spoke with the calm, even tone of someone reading an inventory report. She said that the file on his desk was the 12th version. She said the number slowly, shaping each word with care, because she wanted it to be the first thing that fell between them. The 12th version, not the 2nd, not the 4th. 12 versions, each one representing 4 weeks of work after office hours, each one made from nights spent at the kitchen table in her Dorchester apartment, with her laptop open and a cup of cold coffee beside her, matching shipping manifests against customs declarations until the numbers blurred before her eyes. Then, she told him the second thing. She had corrected every single point he had asked her to correct. Not one had been missed. Each time the plan came back with those 2 handwritten words in the corner, Mr. Doyle would find her in the hallway and deliver the message, always in that same considerate voice, always with some small reassurance that the boss appreciated her effort. The first time, he said the costs were too high. She cut them nearly in half. The 4th time, he said the timeline was too long, that 3 years was too much for a maritime shipping company. She compressed it to 18 months. The 9th time, he said the boss didn't want any outside auditing firm involved, and that left her sitting motionless in her car for nearly 20 minutes, because she had never written a single line about an outside audit. But she crossed out the part she had never written anyway, because she had learned that arguing was a luxury reserved for people whose mothers weren't lying in a hospital. She changed everything. 12 times. And 12 times it came back with those same 2 words, written with the same pen, in the same corner of the page, as though the paper had passed through a machine rather than through the hands of a human being. Then she told him the 3rd thing, and it was the only one of the 3 that caused her voice to slip slightly out of rhythm. She said she didn't need praise. She had never waited for a word of thanks from him in 6 years, and she wasn't waiting for one now. She only needed a reason. 1 sentence. A single note in the margin saying that this section was wrong, that part wasn't workable, that he didn't believe this number. Anything that proved someone on the other side of the desk had truly looked at what she had done. Because a rejection with a reason was a conversation, while a rejection without one was only a way of telling someone that they didn't exist. Nolan Rourke still didn't move. Both of his hands remained flat on the desk, exactly where they had been since she entered, and the morning light pouring through the glass behind him kept her from seeing his eyes clearly. He didn't stand. He didn't interrupt her even once, something she hadn't expected, because in 6 years she had never seen anyone speak more than 3 sentences to this man without being stopped. He wasn't angry either. She knew what the crime lord's anger looked like. She had seen it twice, and it didn't look like this. What rested on his face now was an emptiness she couldn't quite name, the expression of a man hearing an unfamiliar sound inside the house where he had lived for 15 years, and being unable to tell where it was coming from. He asked only one question. "Are you finished?" 3 words, without emphasis, without mockery, without threat. A week earlier, Tessa would have lowered her head, apologized, and backed out of the room. But something had broken clean through that morning, and broken things don't bend back into shape. She didn't reach for her bag again. Instead, she rested her hand on the sheet of paper, folded into quarters that she had already set on top of the file, then smoothed it flat with her palm. Slowly, twice, the way someone might smooth a tablecloth before the final meal in a house that was about to be sold. "Now I'm finished," she said. Then she turned away. She took 5 steps toward the door, and when her hand closed around the handle, she stopped there without looking back, because she knew that if she turned and looked at him one more time, she would lose her courage and pick that paper up again. "Do you know what I wrote that version for?" she asked the door. "It wasn't to save you money." Then she walked out, and the door closed behind her with the faintest sound, and in the room that had suddenly become far too large, Nolan Rourke remained alone with 2 sheets of paper before him and a question that, for the first time in 14 months, no one was already waiting in the hallway to answer for him. He remained sitting that way for a long while after the sound of her footsteps had vanished completely down the hallway. Then he reached out, and the first thing he picked up wasn't the file. It was the sheet of paper folded into quarters. He opened it across the desk, and his finger stopped at the crease. The fold wasn't sharp. It had grown soft and frayed through the middle, where the paper had been opened and folded again so many times that the fibers had begun to separate, and near the upper end of the crease was a tiny tear that hadn't quite split through. He knew this kind of paper. It was standard office printer stock, 80 grams in weight, and the laser ink on it had faded to a muted gray that paper printed the week before wouldn't have had. He turned it over. There were no handwritten notes, only the today's date freshly filled in at the upper corner above a line of text that had been drafted 14 months ago, and he looked at that worn sheet twice before he understood what it meant. 14 months. This sheet of paper had been sitting inside the handbag of the woman who had just walked out of his office for 14 months, waiting for the day she would finally date and submit it, and only that worn crease knew how many times she had taken it out and put it away again. He placed the resignation letter on his left. Then he pulled the file toward him and opened the first page. He couldn't remember the last time he had opened an internal report without someone standing beside him to summarize it first. The first page was the table of contents. The second page began with an introduction, exactly 160 words long, and he read the entire passage, then read it again. It wasn't what he had expected. She wasn't proposing that they purchase ships, open new routes, or reduce the workforce. She was proposing something so dull it was almost laughable. A 2-layer document reconciliation process for every shipment passing through the port of South Boston. Each container would have 2 independent sets of records, one prepared by operations and the other by accounting, and the 2 sets would have to match in weight, package count, and product codes before the customs declaration could be filed. Every declaration would require 2 signatures from 2 people in different departments, and no one would be allowed to sign twice for the same shipment. He kept reading. Her writing was clear and unadorned, every argument supported by a number and a source. On page 11, she listed the implementation costs. On page 14, she listed what the system would prevent, and he stopped for a long time at the 3rd item on that list. He read all the way to the end, 40 pages. By the time he closed it, the sun had risen higher, and the light across the desk had shifted. He didn't understand why he had rejected it. He didn't understand why he had rejected it 12 times. He opened the drawer on his right and removed a thin folder. Inside were 12 summaries, each a page and a half long, prepared by Doyle and handed to him before every signature. He found the most recent summary, pulled it out, and placed it to the right of the file. Then he began checking it line by line. The summary stated that the proposal would slow cargo flow by approximately 40% during the transition period. He turned back to page 11 of the original. The figure there was 7%, accompanied by a calculation showing exactly where the number had come from. He continued reading. The summary stated that Miss Ashby proposed hiring an independent outside auditing firm to oversee the entire process. He turned through all 40 pages again, from beginning to end, more slowly this time, and found no mention of an outside audit anywhere. Not a single word. He sat straighter. The summary stated that the proposal required the hiring of 11 additional employees. The original stated that no new employees were needed, only that signing authority be divided between 2 positions that already existed. The summary stated that the proposal's purpose was to reduce operating costs. The original, in the opening passage, on the 4th line of the 2nd page, stated that its purpose was to eliminate the possibility of a single individual approving a shipment without independent verification. He read that line again. Then he reached for the other 11 summaries and spread them across the desk in a row, and he compared each summary against each proposal. And for more than 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the turning of paper. The more he compared them, the clearer the shape of what had happened became, and it wasn't the shape of random mistakes. Every summary distorted exactly 1 point, and the distorted point was always the one most likely to make the proposal appear unreasonable in his eyes. Near noon, he finally stopped. He looked at the 2 stacks of paper on the desk, the stack on the left containing what Tessa Ashby had written, the stack on the right containing what he had read, and he understood one very simple truth that he could no longer avoid. In 14 months, he hadn't read a single word Tessa Ashby had written. He didn't leave the office at all that day. He canceled 3 appointments without giving a reason, and when Doyle knocked at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to ask about the following week's schedule, he answered through the closed door that he wasn't seeing anyone that day. He heard the man's footsteps pause for a moment outside before moving away. He called Marcus Kane at 11:40 that night. Marcus answered on the first ring, as he always did, and didn't ask what had happened. Nolan gave him 3 orders, each one delivered in a single sentence. The first was to retrieve from the server every original file belonging to the 12 proposals, under Tessa Ashby's name. Not the printed copies, not anything forwarded through another person, but the original files together with the editing logs, showing who opened them, who saved them, and at what time. The second was to pull every customs declaration filed by Rourke Maritime over the previous 14 months and compare each declared weight against the corresponding bill of lading without overlooking a single shipment, including those whose accounts had already been closed. Before giving the third order, he remained silent for nearly 3 seconds. Then he told Marcus to pull Tessa Ashby's personal records, bank accounts, credit history, medical records belonging to her relatives, tax filings, everything. The other end of the line went quiet for a moment. Then Marcus asked, "You suspect her?" Nolan looked at the 2 stacks of paper that had remained untouched on his desk since morning, the stack on the left and the stack on the right, and said, "I suspect myself." Marcus didn't ask another question. He only said the shipping documents would take a few hours because he had to retrieve them from 3 separate systems, and that he would call back when he had something worth calling about. Nolan didn't go home. He stayed in the office, turned off every light except the desk lamp, and began reading the first version of the proposal from the beginning, the one he had crossed out 14 months earlier. He realized it was much shorter than the versions that followed, only 19 pages, written with a degree of care that bordered on timidity, and on the final page, there was a line he hadn't seen in any of the later versions. It stated that if management needed more time to consider the proposal, she was willing to present it in person at any time, even outside regular office hours. That line disappeared after the first version. Marcus called back at 4:15 in the morning. His voice was flat, without emphasis anywhere, and that made what he said feel even heavier. He began with the customs declarations. Over 14 months, there had been 43 declarations in which the weight listed on the customs form didn't match the weight shown on the bill of lading for the same shipment. The differences weren't large, ranging from 3 to 9%, just small enough to avoid triggering an automatic customs alert and just consistent enough that they couldn't have been data entry mistakes. All 43 declarations carried the same final approval signature, Tessa Ashby's. Nolan said nothing. Marcus continued. As for the server logs, all 12 original files had been created and edited through Miss Ashby's account, most of them between 9 o'clock at night and 2 o'clock in the morning. There was no indication that anyone else had altered the files. But there was one detail, Marcus said. After she made the final save, every original file had been opened by a second account within less than 24 hours, and that account had only opened them. It hadn't saved or changed anything. Nolan asked which account it was. Marcus said he needed more time to determine that, because the access had passed through a shared login layer used by the advisory department, Nolan told him to find out no matter what it took. Then Marcus moved to the last part, warning him first that he wasn't going to like it. Tessa Ashby's financial records were surprisingly clean. She had no credit cards, except one with a low limit. She didn't travel. She had paid the rent on her Dorchester apartment on time for 6 straight years. The medical debt in her name totaled $187,400, and she was paying it in installments under an agreement with the hospital, a monthly amount Marcus read aloud before adding that it consumed almost 1/3 of her income after taxes. But one item didn't match anything else in the record. 2 years earlier, in March, $40,000 in cash had been deposited into her account. It had been divided into 5 deposits, each one under $10,000 so it wouldn't have to be reported. The deposits were made at 5 different branches over the course of 9 days. There was no source, no loan agreement, no guarantor, and no repayment of any kind afterward. The money entered her account and went directly to the hospital within 48 hours, and then her balance returned to exactly what it had been before, the balance of someone living on a salary and nothing else. Marcus paused. Then he said, "There are only 2 possibilities. She's a rat. Someone out there is paying her. And this so-called 2-layer reconciliation process is only a way to build a system she already knows how to get around. Or she's stealing, and those 43 declarations are the proof. Pick one." Nolan didn't answer immediately. He looked through the glass at the city, where the darkness was beginning to fade into gray, and he thought about a fold in a piece of paper that had grown so soft it was almost torn through. Then he said, "Or she was paying for something." At that same moment, about 5.5 miles to the south, Tessa was sitting on the kitchen floor of her Dorchester apartment, with her laptop resting on her thighs and an open notebook beside her. She had been sitting that way since before dawn. Her phone vibrated for the 4th time that night, and this time she answered. Cassidy Vaughn didn't say hello. She asked immediately whether Tessa had just submitted her resignation, because the entire 40th floor was talking about it. Tessa said yes. There was a brief silence on the other end before Cassidy's voice broke through, and she asked the question Tessa had spent the past 18 hours trying not to think about. "What about your mother's insurance?" Tessa didn't answer right away. She looked down at the notebook, where she had already written 3 columns of figures at 2 o'clock that morning, and she began reading each column aloud to Cassidy, because she didn't know any other way to speak about fear except to turn it into a series of calculations. The first column was insurance. Under the COBRA program, she could keep the company's health insurance plan for up to 18 months after leaving her job, but she would have to pay the entire premium the company had previously covered, along with an administrative fee. She had called Human Resources under the pretense of asking for a coworker, and they had quoted her $1,900 a month for a 2-person plan. $1,900. The second column was what she had. There were $5,800 left in her savings account, money she had put aside over 2 years by not buying a new coat and not going anywhere during her vacations. Divided by 1,900. It would last 3 months. 3 months, and that was only if she didn't eat, didn't pay rent, and didn't buy gas. Once those things were included, the number fell to 5 weeks. The third column was the debt, $187,400. All in her name, being paid in installments under an agreement with the hospital, and the terms of that agreement stated that if she missed 2 consecutive payments, the entire remaining balance would be transferred to a collection agency. She finished reading all 3 columns and stopped. Cassidy said, "You have to withdraw the resignation." Tessa said she knew. Cassidy said, "Then withdraw it. Call them this morning. Tell them you were exhausted. Tell them you said it in the heat of the moment. They'll understand." Tessa said she knew. Then she ended the call, because she didn't want Cassidy to hear the silence that followed. At 7 o'clock that morning, she showered, put on the coat she had worn through 4 winters, and drove north. Starrow Drive was congested, and it took her 40 minutes to get there. She parked on the 3rd level of the hospital garage, turned off the engine, and sat without moving. From where she was, she could see the entrance to the treatment wing, and she knew exactly how many steps it took to reach the elevator, whether to turn left or right on the 7th floor, and which door belonged to the room. She had walked that route 3 times a week for 14 months. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. She sat there for 9 minutes. During those 9 minutes, she tried 3 opening sentences in her mind, and all 3 broke apart before she could reach the end. The first was the truth, that she had quit her job, and she could already imagine her mother asking why, and then she would have to explain. And when the explanation was over, her mother wouldn't say anything else. Margaret would simply turn her face toward the wall, because she was the kind of woman who would rather endure anything than allow her daughter to pay a price for her. The second was a lie, that she had just been promoted, and she had used that line too many times already, so there was nowhere left for it to go. The third was to say nothing at all, to go upstairs and sit beside her for 2 hours as she always did, and she knew her mother would see through her within the first 3 minutes, because she always did. At the 9th minute, Tessa started the car. She didn't go up to the 7th floor. She drove down the garage ramp, paid the $4 parking fee, and went home. And throughout the entire drive back, she didn't turn on the radio. It was nearly noon when she reached the apartment. She hung her coat on its hook, poured herself a glass of water, and sat down in the same place on the kitchen floor where she had been sitting before dawn. Then she opened the notebook again and recalculated the second column one more time, just in case she had made a mistake before. She hadn't. Then her phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from a number she had never saved. "You submitted your resignation. That was an interesting decision. We should talk before you do anything more foolish." It was signed with 2 capital letters at the end. Tessa read it 3 times. Then she placed the phone face down on the table and sat perfectly still. And in that silence, she understood that for the past 14 months, she had miscalculated one fundamental thing. She had believed the worst thing that could happen was losing her job. She had been wrong. He sent the address the following morning, a breakfast place on Broadway in Southie, and the meeting time was 7 o'clock, earlier than most offices opened. When Tessa arrived, Arthur Doyle was already seated at the table farthest in the back. He had ordered coffee for both of them, and he rose to pull out her chair just as he had done for 6 years whenever they met in the hallway. He asked how she had slept. He asked whether her car had passed inspection the month before, because she had mentioned it the last time they spoke, and he remembered. He always remembered. That was what everyone who worked under him said when they praised him, that Mr. Doyle remembered the names of everyone's children, remembered wedding anniversaries, remembered who had recently lost someone and who had fallen ill, and Tessa had once believed that was the mark of a kind man. It had taken her a long time to understand that his memory wasn't a gift. It was a ledger. He asked whether she wanted anything to eat. She said no. He nodded, stirred his coffee, and said he was very sorry to hear about what had happened on Tuesday, and that he understood, truly understood, because anyone who worked long enough eventually reached the point of exhaustion, and she had worked harder than anyone else on the 40th floor. Then he moved on to something else with such ease that it sounded as though he were simply continuing an old conversation. He asked whether she remembered March 2 years earlier. Tessa lowered her hands into her lap. He continued in the same gentle voice, saying that her mother had needed to be admitted to the hospital immediately, and the hospital had required a deposit she didn't have, and that Tessa had been sitting on the emergency stairway on the 39th floor, crying, when he happened to pass by. He didn't repeat what he had done afterward. He only said that $40,000 was not a small amount of money, and that he had given it to her without asking a single question, without paperwork, without a contract, without interest, without her signature appearing anywhere. He said that part twice, the part about there being no paperwork, and he said it in the reassuring tone of someone trying to put her at ease, but Tessa understood exactly what it meant. It meant that if she spoke, there would be nothing proving the money had come from him. It meant that $40,000 in untraceable cash, sitting in her account, belonged to her, and only her, and that it had appeared around the same time the customs declarations had begun showing discrepancies. Then he slipped a hand inside his coat, took out a sheet of paper, folded in half, placed it on the table, and turned it toward her so she could read it. Tessa recognized it immediately. It was a post-transplant financial guarantee letter, the kind of document every transplant center required from every patient on the waiting list, a written assurance that funds would be available to pay for anti-rejection medication and all follow-up care after the transplant, expenses that would continue for the rest of the patient's life, and that insurance would cover only in part. Without that letter, the patient's file would be moved to inactive status. Inactive meant the patient's name still remained in the system, but when a compatible organ became available, the system would pass over them. At the bottom of the page, beneath the line marked guarantor, was Arthur Doyle's signature. She had known such a letter existed. She had never seen whose signature was on it. Doyle said nothing for a while. He let her finish reading. Then he said, "I don't control the list. No one controls the list. It's an algorithm. It doesn't care who is rich, and who is poor, and I believe that's how it should be. I only control the piece of paper that keeps her on it." He folded the letter, returned it to the inside of his coat, and took a sip of coffee. Then he told her the 3 things he needed, and he said them in the voice of a man offering advice for her own good, not a man imposing conditions. First, she would withdraw her resignation that day, before 10 o'clock. Second, she would continue signing the customs declarations exactly as she had been signing them, without changing anything and without asking questions. Third, and he placed the slightest emphasis on this one, she would not speak privately with the boss. No private meetings, no private calls, no messages. Anything she needed to submit would go through him, as it had for the past 6 years. "I'm doing this to protect you, Tessa," he said. "You're standing in the middle of something very ugly, and you can't see the whole picture. I can." Then he stood, left enough money on the table to pay for both cups of coffee, put on his coat, and before walking away, he rested one hand very lightly on her shoulder, exactly the way a devoted uncle might comfort his niece, and said, "Think about your mother." Then he walked out the door. Tessa remained seated before the untouched cup of coffee, and what sent a chill down her spine wasn't anything he had just said. It was the fact that from beginning to end, he hadn't threatened her once. She remained in the diner for another 20 minutes after he left, and during those 20 minutes, she didn't think about the letter. She thought about the 12 proposals. She had written the first one in September, 14 months earlier, 3 weeks after Doyle first appeared in the doorway of her office at 7 o'clock in the evening and placed a completed customs declaration on her desk, lacking only the final signature, then told her the shipment was urgent and they needed to skip the bill of lading verification so it could clear before the port closed. That first proposal asked for exactly one thing: that no declaration be submitted without confirmation of the shipment's weight from the accounting department, even in an emergency. It came back 9 days later, with 2 words written in the corner. She wrote the 4th version in December, after discovering that the product codes on 3 consecutive shipments had been altered after she signed them, changed during the final stage, at the point where only the advisory department had access. That version proposed locking every declaration file the moment final approval was signed, preventing anyone at any level of authorization from changing it afterward. It came back 11 days later with 2 words written in the corner. She wrote the 9th version in May, after spending an entire night reviewing 18 months of shipping records and realizing that among the 43 problematic shipments, only one name appeared in the final signature box, and that name was hers. That version proposed that every declaration require 2 signatures from 2 people in different departments, and that no one be permitted to sign twice for the same shipment. It came back 8 days later with 2 words written in the corner, and that time Doyle found her in the hallway and told her the boss didn't want any outside auditing firm involved, a statement that had nothing to do with anything she had written, and she had stood there nodding because she had no other choice. The other 9 proposals were the same, each one addressing a different gap, each gap marking a place where she had seen a hand reach through, and all 9 came back with those same 2 words, written with the same pen, in the same corner of the page, 12 times. Anyone looking from the outside would have seen a devoted employee trying to reform a maritime shipping company. But Tessa wasn't trying to reform anything. She didn't care how much money Rourke Maritime saved, didn't care whether cargo moved quickly or slowly, didn't care about any number in those 40 pages, except for one thing. She was building a system in which her own signature would become meaningless. If every declaration required 2 independent signatures, then her signature alone couldn't submit anything. If the file was locked the moment she signed it, no one could change it behind her back. If accounting had to confirm the weight first, then a second person would see the number, and if a second person saw it, she would no longer be the only one held responsible. She hadn't asked for a promotion, she hadn't asked for a raise. For 14 months, 12 separate times, using the only language a company was willing to recognize, the language of procedures and spreadsheets and implementation costs, she had reached out and asked to be saved. And 12 times, that hand had been sent back to her, crossed out, without a single note. She thought about all of this as she sat in the breakfast diner on Broadway, and she thought about how the guarantee letter had already been inside Doyle's coat when he walked in, which meant he had prepared it before she arrived, which meant he had known she would sit down. She thought about his claim that he was doing this to protect her. She thought about how, for 6 years, everything she sent upstairs had passed through his hands, and everything sent down from upstairs had passed through his hands as well, and not once Had she ever heard the boss say anything about her work except through Doyle's mouth? Then she thought about the $1,900 a month, about 5 weeks, about the figure of $187,400, and she understood that if she withdrew her resignation before 10 o'clock that morning, she would continue signing, and every declaration she signed would become another brick in the wall that someone would one day use to imprison her. While Doyle stood outside it with clean hands and an excellent memory, she opened her phone. She composed a message to that number, read it 3 times before pressing send, and the message contained only one line, saying that she was deeply grateful he had taken the time to meet with her, but she wouldn't withdraw her resignation. Then she turned off the screen, stood, left the cup of cold coffee untouched on the table, and stepped out onto Broadway at 7:45 that morning, knowing perfectly well that she had just removed with her own hands the only thing keeping her safe. The call came at 2 o'clock that same afternoon from another number she hadn't saved, but this time the voice on the other end belonged to a man she had heard for 6 years and had never once heard over the phone. He didn't introduce himself. He only gave her an address in Charlestown near the old docks and told her to be there at 4 o'clock, then added a single sentence before ending the call. If she didn't come, he wouldn't call again. She arrived at 3:55. The place was small, with only 6 tables, the kind of diner that served sandwiches and clam chowder to dock workers. And Nolan Rourke sat alone at a table beside the window in an ordinary coat, with no car parked outside and no one standing in the corner of the room. She looked around once and couldn't find Marcus Kane anywhere, and that made her more cautious, not less. She sat across from him. He didn't greet her. He didn't ask whether she wanted anything to drink. He reached down to the chair beside him, picked up 2 sheets of paper, and placed them on the table before her, one on the left and one on the right, separated by roughly the width of a hand. Then he drew his hands back, rested them in his lap, and said nothing more. Tessa looked down. She recognized the page on the left immediately, because she had typed every word on it. It was page 11 of the 12th proposal, with the calculation, the sources, and the figure of 7% on the 3rd line. She had never seen the page on the right in her life. She read it slowly from top to bottom once, then began again from the first line, and during that second reading, her finger started moving along each line as though she were checking a column of figures. 40%. Outside auditing. 11 additional employees. She stopped at the final line on the page to the right, the line stating that the proposal's purpose was to reduce operating costs, and she remained still for a long time. Beyond the window came the sounds of cranes and ship horns, and from behind the counter came the clatter of dishes, but at their table, there was nothing. Nolan didn't rush her. He didn't explain where the page on the right had come from. He only sat there watching her read, and Tessa knew he was watching, but she didn't look up. She thought about the night she had sat in her car for 20 minutes because of that remark about an outside audit. She thought about how she had crossed out a section she had never written, and blamed herself for being unable to remember when she had written it. She thought about the 11 other pages, exactly like the one on the right, that had to exist somewhere. Then she smiled. It wasn't laughter. Only a breath pushed through her nose as the corners of her mouth lifted barely a fifth of an inch before falling again, and there was nothing amused in it. "I thought you hated me," she said. She still didn't raise her head. She went on, saying that for 14 months, she had invented countless reasons to explain the 2 words written in the corner of every proposal, that he didn't trust women in positions like hers, that he already had someone else chosen for her job, that perhaps she had once said the wrong thing in an elevator and he had remembered it. She said she had considered the possibility that he hated her so much that there were nights when she sat rereading every sentence in her emails, searching for what she had done wrong, and she said that at least the theory had made sense, because hatred had a reason, and anything with a reason was something a person could try to fix. Nolan listened to all of it. Then he said, "I don't hate you." He paused. "I don't even know you." He said it neither as a confession nor as an excuse, but in the same voice he used to read a number from a report, and perhaps that was why it cut more deeply than anything Mr. Doyle had said to her that morning. Tessa looked up for the first time since sitting down. She met his eyes and said, "That's worse." Then she fell silent, and in that silence, something rose into her throat that she had to swallow twice before it went down. He asked her one question. Had anyone else read the original before it reached his desk? Tessa looked at the page on the right for another moment, and she thought of the hand that had rested on her shoulder that morning, and she thought of $40,000 with no paperwork, and she thought that if she gave him a name now, and if the man sitting before her today returned tomorrow to being the man he had been for the past 14 months, then her name would be on Doyle's desk before nightfall. "Everything I submit goes through the advisory department," she said. "That's the procedure." Then she stood, put on her coat, and before leaving, she told him that if he needed the originals of the other 11 proposals, they were on the server in the folder bearing her name, and he was the only person in the building who could open it without asking anyone's permission. She had taken 3 steps toward the door when he called her name. Not Miss Ashby. Her name. She stopped, realizing that it was the first time in 6 years she had heard him address her that way, and she stood there for a moment before turning around. He was still seated. 60 days, he said. She asked what 60 days meant. He told her to stay for 60 days, not to return to her old job, not to sign anything else, not to submit anything to anyone. He said he needed time to deal with an internal problem, and he needed someone who understood the documentation system to remain in the building until he had resolved it. And in all of Rourke Maritime, there was only one person who understood that system well enough to reconstruct it from the beginning, on a blank sheet of paper. He said her resignation letter would remain untouched in his drawer and wouldn't be submitted to Human Resources. And after 60 days, if she wanted it to take effect, it would take effect. If she wanted to withdraw it, she could withdraw it, and no one in that building would have the right to ask her a single question about her decision. When he finished, he stopped. He didn't mention salary. He didn't make any further promises. Tessa stood in the middle of the diner with her handbag still in one hand, and she considered the offer quickly. She thought about 5 weeks. She thought about how 60 days was more than 8 weeks, and 8 weeks of active insurance meant 8 more weeks in which her mother could receive 3 treatments a week without Tessa having to sell her car. She thought about how, if she stayed, she would have to walk past Doyle's office every day, and he would know that she hadn't withdrawn her resignation, and he would know that she was sitting inside the building, without doing her old job, and he would begin asking himself, why? She thought that staying meant placing herself between 2 men, one who carried her mother's signature in his coat pocket, and another who, until the day before, hadn't even known who she was. She returned to the table, but didn't sit down. She placed her handbag on the chair and remained standing, then told him she would stay for 60 days on one condition. Nolan said nothing. "Once a week," she said. "You and me. No Mr. Doyle. No summaries. No one standing between us. I present, and you listen. If you disagree, you say so right there, and you tell me why. I don't need you to agree. I need you to speak." She delivered the final sentence more slowly than the 3 that had come before it. "You listen to me. You don't listen to someone talking about me." From the table behind them came the faint sound of a spoon touching the side of a bowl. Nolan looked at her, and he held her gaze longer than Tessa found comfortable, and she forced herself to stand perfectly still throughout that silence, because she knew that if she shifted her feet even once, the condition would lose all its weight. Then he said, "That's an unusual condition." She replied, "You're an unusual boss." He didn't smile, but something at the corner of his eyes shifted almost imperceptibly, only for a moment, and then it disappeared. "I agree," he said. He didn't bargain over a single word. He didn't ask why. He didn't suggest changing once a week to once a month, didn't propose having a secretary present to take minutes, didn't suggest anything at all. He simply spoke those 2 words, then took a pen and a folded sheet of blank paper from inside his coat and wrote 4 lines on it: the starting date, the ending date, her condition exactly as she had stated it, and a final line declaring that the resignation letter originally drafted 14 months earlier would remain valid at the discretion of the person who had signed it. Then he signed his name beneath the words with a black fountain pen, turned the paper around, and pushed it toward her. Tessa looked at the pen. She looked at it longer than necessary. Then she picked it up, realizing that her hand had grown slightly cold, and she signed. Her handwriting was as neat as it had always been, because over 6 years she had signed that name thousands of times. Most often in the lower right corner of declarations she wasn't permitted to question. This was the first time she had signed it, in a place she had chosen for herself. She handed the pen back. He took it, returned it to the inside pocket of his coat, and said, "Next Tuesday." She asked what time and where. He said 6 o'clock in the morning, then gave her an address at the port of South Boston. Not a building, not a conference room, but the number of a dock. Tessa entered it into her phone and asked nothing more. She put on her coat, picked up her handbag, and left the diner before he did. Outside, darkness had begun to settle, and wind from the harbor swept up the hill against her. She got into her car, locked the doors, and remained still for a while with both hands resting on the steering wheel. She had just bought herself 60 days, and she knew perfectly well that the following morning, when she passed through security on the 40th floor, someone would be standing in the hallway watching her walk by and wondering why she was still there. At 6 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the sky was still dark, and the wind coming off the water swept sideways across the dock, and Nolan was already standing there in a heavy coat, alone beside a stack of containers that had been unloaded the night before. Tessa arrived carrying a clipboard and no computer. He didn't ask how she was. He only tilted his head toward the row of containers and told her to speak. She began with the simplest point, indicating the label attached beside a container door and explaining that the number printed there was the weight declared by the shipper, while the number appearing on the customs declaration was entered manually by the company itself, and between those two numbers lay a gap that no one was required to verify. Nolan listened. Then he asked what her process would do if accounting and operations entered the same shipment and arrived at two different figures, and which side would be considered correct. Tessa paused for a moment. It was a technical question. It was a question only someone who had read as far as page 17 could have asked. She answered, and her answer was long, nearly 4 minutes, because it had 3 separate branches, and each branch contained an exception. And throughout those 4 minutes, he didn't interrupt her once, didn't look at his phone, didn't nod in that way. People nodded when they wanted someone else to hurry. He stood there, looking at the place she was pointing to, and waited until she had finished. Tessa heard her own voice reach the end of the final sentence and fall silent, and in the quiet that followed, she realized her heart was beating faster than usual, and she found that absurd, because all she had done was explain a document reconciliation process. 6 years. 6 years. And this was the first time anyone had asked her a question, and remained long enough to hear the entire answer. He asked 2 more questions. By 7:15, daylight had fully arrived and her voice had gone hoarse. He said, "Tomorrow, same time." She said, "You said once a week." He replied, "I changed my mind." Then he walked toward his car without saying anything else. At 9 o'clock that morning, Tessa was seated at the side desk outside his office, arranging the original proposals, when Silas Rourke stepped out of the elevator. She had met him a few times during her 6 years there, always only in passing, and this time he walked straight inside without waiting to be announced. The door didn't close completely. Tessa wasn't trying to listen, but soundproofing only worked when the door was shut. She heard Silas say that he had submitted his application and had been accepted into the architecture program for the spring term, and he said he wasn't asking for money, that he had already worked everything out, and all he wanted was permission to remove his name from everything in the company that carried the Rourke name. She heard him say that he didn't want anyone to have to choose sides. He only wanted to leave. Then she heard Nolan's voice, brief, even, without rising in the slightest. He said no. He said Silas couldn't withdraw because his name appeared in 3 legal entities, and removing it from one would affect the other 2. He said this wasn't the time. He said he would have someone review the matter in the next quarter. The entire conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Then there was silence. Then came the sound of a chair being pushed back. Silas walked out, and he didn't slam the door. He closed it very gently, and that unsettled Tessa more than if he had slammed it. He passed her desk, then stopped. He looked at the stack of original proposals on the surface, looked at her name in the corner of the folder, and asked how long she had worked there. She said 6 years. He nodded as though the number had confirmed something. Then he said, "Don't try." Tessa asked what she wasn't supposed to try. Silas said that he had asked to leave 4 times in 3 years, and all 4 conversations had ended in less than a minute, and not once had his brother become angry, and that was the frightening part. He said people kept thinking his brother was cruel, but cruelty required a person to feel something first. Then he pressed the elevator button, and before the doors opened, he said one last thing without looking at her, his eyes fixed instead on the metal doors reflecting both of them. "He isn't broken. He's frozen." The elevator doors opened and closed again, and Tessa remained there with the stack of papers before her, thinking about a man who had stood on a windswept dock at 6 o'clock in the morning and waited through a 4-minute answer, and she didn't know how to place those 2 images beside each other. On their second morning, they walked along dock number 4, and she talked about product codes. On the third morning, He brought the original copy of the sixth proposal, with pencil notes written in the margins, and it took her a moment to understand that the notes were his. On the fifth morning, he asked why the ninth version was shorter than the eighth, and she said that by then, she had begun to believe people were more likely to finish reading something if it was shorter. On the seventh morning, it rained, and they stood beneath the corrugated metal roof of a warehouse, and he asked her a question that had nothing to do with shipping documents. He asked what she had studied. Tessa said she had gone to college for 2 years, and then left. He didn't ask why, but he didn't say anything else either, and the silence stretched long enough that she answered on her own. She said her father had worked as a welder at the Quincy shipyard for 27 years. She said he died of lung cancer in the spring of the year she turned 19, and after that, tuition became something that no longer belonged on the list. She said he hadn't left much behind: a toolbox, a car with more than 200,000 miles on it, and one sentence he had repeated so many times that she had memorized it before she was old enough to understand it. People pay you to do the work, not to disappear. She said he had taught her that because he had once worked somewhere the foreman could never remember anyone's name. And he had hated that place more than he had hated anything else in his life. Nolan didn't comment, but the following morning, he arrived 10 minutes before she did, and when she reached the dock, he was already standing in their usual place. On the 9th morning, he told her something. He told her without being asked, and that was what Tessa remembered most clearly about that morning. He said his mother had died when he was 17, and Silas had only been 4 and couldn't remember anything about her, and he said that sometimes he thought that was a mercy for the boy. He said his father died when Nolan was 22. He described the circumstances in the same voice he used to read a report, saying that the company had been expanding at the time, and someone from outside had brought his father a very thick, very convincing restructuring plan filled with tables and projections, and his father had trusted it. He put nearly all of the company's liquid assets into it, and he signed documents he hadn't read all the way through, and within 9 months everything collapsed, while the man who had brought him the plan was already living in another state. He said his father hadn't survived that year. He didn't say how the man had died, and Tessa didn't ask. He went on, saying that he had been 22 then, and Silas had been 9, and for the next 3 years, exactly one person had stepped forward to hold everything together, signing Silas's guardianship papers, paying the boy's school fees, sitting across from the creditors, and running the company in Nolan's place until he was old enough and clear-headed enough to take control. He said the man's name, and he said it naturally, the way someone might speak the name of a member of his own family. Arthur Doyle. Tessa stood still. She didn't shift her feet. Nolan said that Doyle had never asked for anything. He could have taken everything during those 3 years and no one could have stopped him, but he hadn't. Then Nolan said the thing the entire story had been leading toward. From the day my father died, I learned one thing, and I've held on to it ever since. Change is what kills people. Every plan longer than 40 pages is a trap, and the safest man is the one who doesn't sign anything. When he finished, he looked out across the water. Tessa let the silence remain for a while. Then she said, "No." He turned to look at her. "Change didn't kill your father. Trusting the wrong person killed him. He didn't die because the plan was long. He died because he didn't read it and didn't investigate the man who brought it to him," she continued, and her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't retreat. "You've confused those two things for 15 years, and because you confused them, you spent the past 14 months rejecting something 12 times without ever reading it, all to protect yourself from the very thing that was already happening right beneath your feet." The wind changed direction, and the sound of a crane carried over from the neighboring dock. Nolan didn't answer. He stood there for a long time with both hands in the pockets of his coat, looking toward the rows of containers, and Tessa saw his jaw move once. Then he said, "I have to go." He had taken several steps when he stopped without turning around, and he asked one final question. Which of the 12 versions had she written while she was most afraid? Tessa said, "The 9th. He nodded once and walked away. That afternoon, Marcus Kane called him and said he had traced the second account. Marcus arrived at the office at 7 o'clock that evening and placed a file on the desk that was thinner than Nolan had expected. He said they would begin with the second account, the account that opened all 12 original files after Miss Ashby made her final save belong to the advisory department's shared access layer, and 4 people used the same code, but the building's entry logs weren't shared. On all 12 occasions, The person who swiped a security card to enter the 40th floor during the window when the file was opened was the same person. Marcus didn't say the name. He turned to the next page. Then he moved on to the $40,000. Cash couldn't be traced, but all 5 deposits had been made at a teller's counter, and teller counters had cameras, and the bank kept its camera footage for 3 years. The person standing beside Miss Ashby during all 5 deposits never appeared clearly in the frame, but the car parked outside did, and its license plate belonged to a limited liability company registered in Delaware under a meaningless string of letters. Marcus said he had followed the ownership through 3 layers of intermediary companies, 2 in Delaware and 1 in Nevada. And at the final layer, only 1 name remained in the beneficial owner field. He didn't read the name aloud. He simply turned the page around and pushed it across the desk. Nolan looked down. Arthur Doyle. He said nothing. Marcus continued, his voice still as flat as it had been at the beginning, explaining that he had traced the shell company's entire flow of money backward over 10 years to see where else it had gone. During the most recent 8 years, it had transferred cash to 4 other people inside Rourke Maritime. Marcus read the 4 names. Nolan knew every one of them. 1 worked in logistics, 1 worked in accounts payable, 1 handled vessel documentation, 1 worked in human resources and managed contractor agreements. Marcus asked whether Nolan noticed what they had in common. All 4 of them, along with Miss Ashby, occupied exactly the positions that held final signing authority over some kind of document. None of them held a senior title. None of them made decisions. They only signed. Marcus added that every payment had arrived at precisely the moment its recipient was facing some private crisis. 1 person had a child who needed surgery. 1 was about to lose a house to foreclosure. 1 had parents in Florida who needed to enter a nursing home. None of the 4 had a loan agreement. None had ever been asked to repay the money. Then Marcus delivered the final point. Over 8 years, more than $200,000 had been transferred, and for that amount, Doyle had bought 5 signatures in 5 different places inside the company without a single piece of paper anywhere in the world proving that he had bought them. Nolan didn't respond. He sat motionless with both hands resting on the desk, as they always did, and stared down at the 4 names. Marcus stood there waiting. 1 minute passed, then 2. Marcus asked what Nolan wanted him to do. Nolan didn't answer. He reached for the glass of water on the desk, the glass that had remained full since the afternoon, and he didn't drink from it. He only held it. In his mind was one very specific date, a day 14 months earlier, when Doyle had placed the first summary in front of him and said that Miss Ashby downstairs had an interesting idea, but it wasn't practical yet, and Nolan had picked up his father's fountain pen and written 2 words in the corner without turning to the second page. He thought about the 11 times that followed. He thought about the windswept dock at 6 o'clock in the morning, and a woman speaking for 4 uninterrupted minutes, because no one stopped her. He thought about what she had told him that morning, that he had confused those 2 things for 15 years. Then came the sound of breaking glass. It wasn't loud. It was a clean, dry crack, followed by water spilling across the desk and dripping onto the floor, and then silence. Marcus didn't move. Nolan remained in the same position, his hand still where it had been, and he looked down at the wet surface of the desk for so long that Marcus finally had to look away. Then Nolan opened the drawer on his left, took out the black fountain pen, placed it on the desk before him, and spoke in a low, even voice that was almost ordinary. For 14 months, I signed to keep her trapped inside it, with my father's pen. Marcus asked whether Nolan wanted him to call Doyle upstairs. Nolan said no. He said Doyle couldn't be allowed to know anything, not a single sign, no changes to the meeting schedule, no revoked access, nothing at all. Then he said Marcus had to do 2 things. The first was to find the financial guarantee letter the hospital kept in Margaret Ashby's file and determine whose name appeared as the guarantor. The second, and here he paused for a moment, was to have someone follow Silas. Marcus asked why Silas. Nolan said, because if I were him, and I had spent 8 years building this, the person I would fear most right now wouldn't be me. It would be anyone who had started asking questions. The call from the hospital came at 11:40 that night, 2 days later. The nurse on duty said Margaret's blood pressure had dropped during the afternoon treatment, and they had been forced to stop halfway through. That she was being monitored in the enhanced care unit on the 7th floor, that her condition had stabilized, but Tessa should come. Tessa arrived at 12:15. The doctor on duty spoke to her for 6 minutes using words she had learned how to hear over the past 14 months. Words like further observation, like haven't ruled out, like depending on how things develop. Then they allowed her to see her mother for 10 minutes. Margaret was asleep. Tessa sat beside the bed without saying anything. And when the 10 minutes were over, she stood, walked back into the hallway, sat down on the row of plastic chairs across from the doors of the enhanced care unit, and stayed there. The 7th floor hallway at 2 o'clock in the morning was almost empty. A nurse passed twice. At the far end of the corridor, the automatic coffee machine flushed itself every 40 minutes. Tessa sat with her back straight and both hands resting in her lap, and she didn't take out her phone. She thought about the figure of 1,900. She thought about the 37 days remaining in the 60 days. She thought that if she had withdrawn her resignation that morning before 10 o'clock, she would still have insurance now, still have her job, still have the guarantee letter bearing the other man's signature resting safely in the file, and her mother would still be active on the transplant list. And the only price she would have had to pay for all of it was to keep signing. She sat with that thought for a long time. She didn't cry. She only sat there and let it pass through her until it had gone all the way through. Sometime after 2:30, the elevator sounded at the end of the hallway. She didn't look up because she assumed it was a nurse. Then someone sat down in the chair a short distance from her, and when she turned, she saw Nolan Rourke. He wore an ordinary coat and no tie. No one had come with him. There was no car parked outside the emergency entrance, and Tessa looked through the hallway window and checked almost instinctively. He held 2 paper cups from the automatic machine at the far end of the corridor, the kind of coffee no one drank unless there was no other choice. He placed 1 cup on the empty chair between them, nudged it gently toward her, then sat upright and looked toward the closed doors across the hallway. He didn't ask how her mother was doing. He didn't ask what the doctor had said. He didn't say he knew a specialist in New York. Didn't say he would call someone. Didn't say let me handle it. He didn't say anything at all. Tessa looked at the coffee for a while before picking it up. The heat came through the paper. "You don't have to do this," she said. Nolan didn't turn toward her. "I know," he said. Then he added, "That's why I'm doing it." After that, neither of them spoke again. At 3 o'clock, a nurse came through the doors of the enhanced care unit and told Tessa that Margaret's readings were holding steady, and Tessa nodded and thanked her. And Nolan didn't ask a single follow-up question about what he had just heard. At 3:20, Tessa finished the coffee. At 4 o'clock, she rested her head against the wall and closed her eyes for nearly 20 minutes, and when she opened them, he was still sitting there in the same position, both hands resting in his lap, looking toward the doors. At 4:40, his phone lit up inside his coat pocket. He took it out, looked at the screen, turned it off, and put it away again. It lit up twice more before dawn, and both times he did exactly the same thing. At 5:15, someone pushed a breakfast cart down the hallway. At 5:40, the window at the far end of the corridor changed from black to gray. Tessa looked toward it and realized that she had been sitting beside this man for almost 3 hours, and he hadn't asked her a single question about work, about the documents, about the 60 days, or about anything else. At 6:10, the morning doctor came out and said that Margaret was awake and would be moved back to a regular room before noon. Tessa stood. She turned toward Nolan, intending to say something, and saw that he was standing too, and she realized she didn't know what to say to a man who had sat silently beside her for 3.5 hours without asking for anything in return. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Then he said, "Take today off. Tomorrow morning too. Dock number 4 on Thursday." Then he walked toward the elevator, and Tessa remained standing in the 7th floor hallway with the empty paper cup in her hand, watching until the elevator doors closed. And what kept her standing there so long wasn't the fact that he had come. It was the fact that during those 3.5 hours, he hadn't once tried to fix anything. On Thursday afternoon, after the session at dock number 4, Tessa returned to the parking garage beneath the building and found a man waiting beside her car. He held up his badge before she could step back and said his name was Reese Talbot, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Boston Field Office. He said he only needed 10 minutes and wouldn't enter the building. Then he handed her a file. Tessa opened it right there. Inside were copies of 43 customs declarations, exactly 43 pages arranged in chronological order, and in the lower right corner of every one was her signature. Some of them she remembered, some she didn't, but the signatures were hers, every one of them. Talbot said that if each declaration could be proven intentionally false, each would constitute a separate federal offense, and that the person whose final signature appeared on the document was always in the worst possible position in a case like this. He said she needed to understand that before he showed her the second thing. Then he turned to the final page in the file. It was a witness statement. At the top of the page was her name, her full legal name, her date of birth, her Dorchester address, and her social security number. The statement contained 3 paragraphs, summarizing Rourke Maritime's activities, written in an administrative style she had never used in her life. In the upper corner was the date the statement had been prepared, and that date was exactly 5 months earlier. Tessa stared at it for a long time. "I never signed this," she said. Talbot said he knew. He said the document hadn't come from her. It had come from an anonymous internal source who had sent it to his office 5 months earlier, along with the supporting records, and the accompanying letter stated that the informant was frightened and needed protection before giving formal testimony. He said he had opened an investigation based on it. He said he had come that day because during those 5 months, the person who was supposedly so afraid had never contacted him again, not even once, and that made him believe something wasn't right. Then he gave her 2 choices. She could cooperate and tell him what she knew, or she could stand alone at the end of those 43 signatures. He left his business card and walked away. Tessa got into her car. She didn't start the engine. She opened the file again and looked at the date in the upper corner of the statement, and she began putting the pieces together. 5 months earlier. She remembered which month that had been, and she remembered that she had just submitted the 9th proposal then, the one she had written while she was most afraid, the one proposing 2 signatures on every declaration. She thought about someone creating a witness statement in her name and sending it to federal investigators, and that person would have needed all her personal information, would have needed to know exactly where she stood in the chain of signatures, and would have needed to know which records to include so the story would fit together. She considered what anyone stood to gain by sending a file like that. It couldn't bring down the company, because 43 declarations differing by only a few percentage points weren't enough to destroy an entire maritime shipping corporation. They were only enough to open an investigation. And once an investigation opened, the first thing that happened inside an organization like Rourke Maritime was that people began searching for whoever had talked. Tessa sat perfectly still. Then she understood. And she understood all of it at once, and the realization was so cold that she had to place both hands on the steering wheel. The person who had created that file didn't need federal agents to arrest anyone. That person only needed the federal investigation to exist, to knock on the door at exactly the right moment, and to leave behind one name. That name was hers, and when her name reached the 40th floor, the only person with the authority to decide what should be done with someone who had betrayed his family would be Nolan Rourke. He would deal with her himself. He would do it while believing completely that he was right, because for 14 months, he hadn't read a single line she had written and hadn't heard a single sentence from her that hadn't passed through someone else's mouth. And when he was finished, there would be $40,000 in untraceable cash in her account to prove motive. There would be a federal witness statement to prove she was a traitor, and there would be one man ready to clean everything up with spotless hands, an excellent memory, and 15 years of being regarded by the entire family as a father. Doyle didn't need to kill anyone. He only needed Nolan Rourke to keep refusing to read. Tessa drove home to Dorchester and sat on the kitchen floor until late that night, with the file open before her, and she calculated, as she always calculated, but this time she couldn't find a single column that balanced. At 11 o'clock that night, on the 40th floor, Nolan's phone lit up with a 4-word message from Marcus Kane. Silas had an accident. Marcus called a moment later. He kept it brief. Silas's car had left Interstate 93 near the Somerville exit at 10:40 that night and struck the guardrail on the right. He was conscious when the ambulance arrived. He had a broken collarbone, 2 fractured ribs, and a concussion. The scans were complete. There was no internal organ damage, and the doctor said he would make a full recovery within a few months. He was being moved to a room and had been given a sedative so he could sleep. Nolan asked only one question, whether anyone else had been in the car. Marcus said no. Nolan reached the hospital at midnight. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Marcus found him in the hallway and told him the rest. The technical team had recovered the car and finished examining it. The rear right brake line had a cut that hadn't been caused by the crash, positioned where ordinary wear could never have reached it, and the depth had been calculated, so the fluid would leak gradually instead of causing an immediate loss of pressure. Marcus continued, and this was the part that made Nolan stand straighter. 3 days earlier, Silas had gone down to the accounting department and asked about a payment made to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. He had questioned 2 people. He hadn't said why. Marcus said Silas had been investigating the legal entities so he could complete the process of removing his name from the subsidiary companies. And he had opened the one drawer that should never have been opened. Nolan said nothing. At 2:20, Tessa arrived. Cassidy had messaged her shortly before midnight, and she had driven up from Dorchester without having time to think about why she was going. She found him standing in the 5th-floor hallway, about 4 steps from the hospital room door, both hands in the pockets of his coat, and she knew immediately that he had been standing in that exact place for a long time. She asked how Silas was. Nolan repeated what the doctor had said, word for word, as though he were reading from a report. Then she asked why he hadn't gone inside. Nolan didn't answer right away. He looked at the door, then he said, "Because if I go in there, I'll start managing it again." He continued, saying that if he stepped through that door, within 30 seconds he would be calling someone, asking for the name of the department's chief physician, demanding a room transfer, arranging for someone to stand guard outside, and turning the entire situation into a list of tasks. And he would do all of it, while his younger brother lay asleep less than 7 feet away. "I don't know any other way," he said. "I never have." Tessa looked at him for a moment, then she walked past him, placed her hand on the door handle, and opened it. "You don't need to know how," she said, holding the door. "You only need to sit down." Nolan remained still for several more seconds. Then he stepped inside. The room was lit only by a small lamp above the bed. Silas was asleep with his face turned to one side, one arm immobilized. A plastic chair stood against the wall. Nolan pulled it out, placed it beside the bed, and sat down. He didn't check the monitoring chart. He didn't go into the hallway to find a nurse. He took his phone from his pocket, turned it completely off, and placed it face down on the bedside cabinet. Then he sat there. Tessa remained in the doorway for a moment before closing it from the outside. She sat on the row of chairs in the hallway and stayed there for nearly an hour, and throughout that entire hour, the door didn't open once. Sometime after 3:30, Nolan came out. He sat down on the row of chairs a short distance from her, exactly as he had sat on the 7th floor that other night, and looked toward the far end of the corridor. Tessa opened her handbag. She took out a small USB drive and held it in her hand for a while before placing it on the empty chair between them. "There's a recording on this," she said. She continued, explaining that it was a conversation from 8 months earlier in the emergency stairwell on the 39th floor between her and Arthur Doyle. And in it, he spoke clearly about the financial guarantee letter, the kidney transplant waiting list, the money from 2 years earlier, and the price of her silence. She said she had started recording from inside her coat pocket before entering the stairwell, and she had kept it for 8 months. Nolan looked at the USB drive, then he asked why she hadn't given it to him sooner. There was no sharpness in the question, but Tessa still had to draw a breath before answering. "Because 8 months ago, if I had given it to you, you would have shown it to him first." She said nothing more. She didn't need to. Nolan sat motionless. He opened his mouth once, then stopped. He thought about the 12 summaries in his drawer, about the 12 times he had lifted the pen, about every occasion when Doyle had stood to his right and said, "Let me handle this." And he realized that if Tessa Ashby had placed that USB drive on his desk 8 months earlier, the first thing he would have done was call Arthur Doyle into the room and ask what he thought of it. He couldn't argue with a single word she had said. He picked up the USB drive and said, "Tomorrow morning, I need you in the main conference room at 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock the following morning, there were 8 people in the main conference room on the 40th floor. The 6 heads of Rourke Maritime's 6 divisions sat along both sides of the table. All of them had heard about the accident the night before, and no one asked any questions. Arthur Doyle sat to Nolan's right, in the chair he had occupied for 15 years, and he had arrived 10 minutes before everyone else, as he always did. Tessa sat at the far end of the table with a file in front of her and didn't open it. Nolan didn't begin with a greeting. He said there would be no minutes taken for this meeting, and that he was going to place 4 things on the table. He set down the first. It consisted of 2 sheets of paper, 1 original page and 1 summary, and he passed them around the table. He explained briefly that one was page 11 of an internal proposal, and the other was the summary prepared from that same page, that the figure on one sheet was 7, while the figure on the other was 40, that one contained no mention of an outside audit while the other did, and that the same thing had happened in exactly the same way across 11 other sets of documents. He said everyone in the room knew who had prepared the summaries. No one spoke. Doyle remained still, with both hands resting on the table. Nolan set down the second item. It was the corporate ownership file for the Delaware Limited Liability Company, including the 2 intermediary layers and the final page bearing the beneficial owner's name. He didn't read the name aloud. He simply pushed the file to his left, so it traveled around the table in the opposite direction from the first set of papers. Then he read the names of the 4 company employees who had received cash from that entity over 8 years, speaking slowly and giving each person's position. And after the 4th name, he paused before saying that none of those 4 people held a decision-making role, but all 4 possessed final signing authority over some form of documentation. He said the total amount was more than $200,000. He said that more than $200,000 couldn't buy a company, but it could buy 5 pens. One of the 6 people at the table pushed his chair back by nearly the width of a hand. No one stood. Nolan placed the 3rd item on the table. It was a phone. He opened an audio file and turned on the speaker. The room filled with the sound of wind moving through an emergency stairwell, the heavy closing of a fire door, and then the voice of a man, warm and unhurried, asking about Margaret Ashby's health. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 10 seconds. During those 4 minutes and 10 seconds, the voice never rose, never made a single threat, and stated 3 things clearly, whose signature appeared on the post-transplant financial guarantee letter, that if the signature were withdrawn, the patient's file would be moved to inactive status, and that the $40,000 from 2 years earlier had no documentation of any kind, so it would be best if neither side ever mentioned it again. When the recording ended, there wasn't a sound in the conference room. Tessa had stared down at the tabletop for the entire 4 minutes and 10 seconds, and hadn't looked up once. Nolan turned off the phone and looked to his right. Arthur Doyle hadn't changed his position. He didn't deny anything. He didn't invoke the 15 years he had given them, didn't mention the 3 years he had spent holding everything together, didn't say a single word about what he had once done for the Rourke brothers. He only looked at Nolan, and when he spoke, his voice was still the same, without sharpness, almost gentle. "Boy, I managed this for 8 years not because I was good at it." He paused. "But because you never read anything twice." Those words remained in the room longer than anything else that had been presented that morning. Nolan didn't answer them. He didn't stand, didn't raise his voice, didn't reach inside his coat. He spoke to Marcus Kane, who was standing at the far end of the room, using the same voice he always used to give an operational order. "Take him out of the city." Then he added, "Alive," he said. "Not 1 cent. No one touches him, and he takes nothing bearing the Rourke name." Marcus nodded. Then Nolan placed the 4th item on the table. It was a file thicker than the other 3 items combined. He pushed it toward Doyle and remained silent for several seconds, allowing the man to see the label on its spine. Then he said it contained the Delaware entity's complete 10-year financial trail, records of all 5 teller deposits with bank camera images, a copy of the guarantee letter bearing Doyle's signature, and a witness statement created 5 months earlier under the name of someone who had never signed it. "Tonight, this file will be on Agent Reese Talbot's desk," he said. Doyle looked at the file. For the first time that morning, something shifted across his face. Nolan said, "You don't need me to testify against you. You've been testifying against yourself for 8 years, every time you signed a piece of paper to keep someone in your hand." Then he stood and announced that the meeting was over. The 6 division heads left the room one by one. Marcus walked around the table. Arthur Doyle rose and fastened the button of his coat with the practiced motion of a man who had been doing it for 40 years, and before stepping out, he turned toward Tessa at the far end of the table. There was no anger in his face, and no resentment. He only looked at her once, very briefly, and that look sent the same chill down her spine that she had felt that morning on Broadway. The first thing Nolan did after the meeting was call the family attorney upstairs, and the second thing he did forced the man to ask him twice whether he had understood correctly. Nolan ordered him to prepare a complete file, proving that Tessa Ashby's 43 signatures had been placed under coercion, together with the entire financial trail, the recording, the guarantee letter, and the server access logs, and submit it to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The attorney said that by doing so, The company would be handing them a detailed map of its internal documentation process over the past 18 months. Nolan said he had understood perfectly. He demanded one more thing. Tessa Ashby wasn't to use the family's attorney, wasn't to receive any payment from the company in connection with the case, and had to retain independent counsel of her own choosing, so no one could later claim that she had testified according to the wishes of whoever was paying her. The next 3 weeks were spent in waiting rooms, signing documents, and answering the same questions over and over again. Tessa's attorney was a woman she found through the State Bar Association's directory, someone with no connection to Boston's underworld, and she built a very simple argument. Her client had signed under duress. There was physical evidence proving that pressure. Her client had submitted 12 written proposals seeking to create a process that would end the very condition under which she had been forced to sign, and all 12 documents carried timestamps on the company server. Agent Reese Talbot spent 10 days verifying everything. By the end of the month, Tessa received a full immunity agreement in exchange for her testimony concerning everything connected to Arthur Doyle. Her name was removed from the 43 declarations as a person under investigation. That afternoon, Marcus Kane entered Nolan's office and stood there for a while before speaking. He said, "You just handed them a thread." He said Talbot now possessed the company's documentation flowchart, the names of 4 additional people, and 10 years of financial records, and that none of it ended with Doyle. It continued beyond him, and they both knew who stood at the end of everything carrying the Rourke name. Nolan didn't deny it. "I gave someone back what I took from her," he said. Marcus said nothing more. 3 days later, Nolan called Tessa upstairs. This time, he didn't place a file on the desk. He told her there were 11 days left in the 60-day period. Then he made her an offer, and he presented it in a way Tessa had never heard him present anything during her 6 years there. He didn't command. He didn't announce. He explained. He said the company was about to begin a 5-year restructuring process, that the 12th proposal would become its framework, and that he needed someone to lead the compliance department, a real position with the authority to veto documents, reporting directly to him and passing through no one else. He named the salary, and it was 3 times what she had earned before. Then he finished and waited, adding nothing to make the offer heavier than it already was. Tessa remained silent for a while. She thought about her mother. She thought about $1,900 a month and $187,400, and she thought that the figure he had just named would erase both burdens in less than 3 years. Then she thought about walking into this building every morning and passing the chair to the right of the conference table, and she thought about how, 20 years from now, if anyone asked what she had done with her life, the answer would always begin with someone else's name. She said no. He didn't ask why, but she continued because she wanted him to hear everything, and because she had set that condition in a small diner in Charlestown, and he had honored it. "If I stay, then for the rest of my life, I'll be the woman you saved. People will tell this story as a chapter in yours. I don't want to be a chapter in anyone else's story. I want a story of my own." Then she stood, and she delivered the final words slowly and without raising her voice. "You have the right to reject me. What you don't have is the right to reject me without ever reading me. Now you've read me, so read me all the way to the end, and let me go." Nolan remained seated for a long time after that. He didn't make a second offer. He didn't tell her she would regret it, didn't say the door would remain open, didn't say anything meant to leave a thread between them. He opened the drawer on his left, took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, its creases worn soft, and placed it on the desk, turning it toward her. Then he picked up the black fountain pen, signed his name in the approval box at the bottom corner, and pushed it across the desk. "Effective today," he said. Tessa picked up the paper. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," walked out, and he said nothing as the door closed behind her. 7 months later, the federal investigation reached the hospital records. When investigators traced the financial trail of the Delaware entity, they discovered that the post-transplant financial guarantee letter bearing Arthur Doyle's signature had been issued on the basis of assets that didn't exist, and the transplant center was forced to review Margaret Ashby's entire file. Tessa was informed that unless a valid guarantee letter was provided within 30 days, her mother's status would be changed to inactive. This time, she didn't have to ask anyone for help. She submitted a copy of her company's business license, the group insurance policy she had purchased for 2 employees and 1 dependent, 3 months of bank statements, and she signed the guarantor line with her own name. The file was restored to active status 11 days later. The call came on a June night, shortly before 3 o'clock in the morning, and Tessa drove to the hospital with both hands trembling on the steering wheel the entire way. The transplant surgery lasted 5 hours. 3 weeks later, Margaret was discharged and no longer had to return 3 times a week. Tessa's company occupied the second floor of an old brick building in Fort Point, 2 rooms and 1 window overlooking the channel. She named it after her father's family name. Her work was to build document reconciliation systems for small transportation companies, businesses that couldn't afford to hire a large auditing firm but didn't want to find themselves sitting in a federal waiting room one day. Cassidy Vaughn was the first person she hired, and Cassidy still liked to remind her that she had once told Tessa to withdraw her resignation, and Tessa still said that Cassidy had been right at the time. Silas Rourke began his first year in the architecture program at Northeastern during the spring semester. His collarbone healed after 4 months. His name had been removed from all 3 legal entities. Rourke Maritime entered the first year of a 5-year process to move all of its operations into a lawful framework. And the foundation of that process was the 12th proposal, almost entirely intact, including the requirement for 2 independent signatures on every customs declaration. Agent Reese Talbot still had an open case, and no one on the 40th floor pretended it had been closed. One afternoon in September, the receptionist called to say that an unexpected visitor was waiting in the lobby. Tessa went downstairs and found Nolan Rourke standing there alone, with no one accompanying him, and a file in his hands. "I came to present a plan," he said. Then he asked, "Do you have 30 minutes?" Tessa looked at him for a moment and said, "I'll listen for as long as you need to speak." They went upstairs to the second floor. He placed the file gently on her desk, and she saw a handwritten line in the upper corner of the cover, written in the black ink of the fountain pen she had seen hundreds of times on hundreds of corners of paper. It wasn't the same 2 words as before. This time, there were 4 different words. "Please read this through." Tessa opened a drawer, took out a client file, typed the date on the first line, and then typed a name that had never appeared on her list before. Then she opened the file to the first page and began to read. There is one thing this story leaves behind, and it has nothing to do with money or power. Every day, many people around us are reaching out for help in the only language they are permitted to use, through a report, an email, or a timid question raised in the middle of a meeting, and they are dismissed not because they are wrong, but because no one is willing to spend a few minutes reading all the way to the end. Respecting another person doesn't mean paying them a high salary or offering them a few words of praise. It means taking the time to listen until they have finished what they are trying to say, and verifying the truth for yourself instead of believing someone else's version of it. Because when we stop listening to someone, there will always be another person willing to step into that silence and speak in their place. And what is spoken is often no longer the truth. And the most valuable thing we can give another person isn't rescue. It is the chance to stand on their own feet again. If today's story touched you, please leave a comment and share your honest thoughts. Have you ever been the person no one listened to at work? And how did you overcome it? Please press the like button, share this video with the people you care about, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to more compelling stories together every day. We truly look forward to reading the words you share from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.